So welcome everybody. My name is Nancy Knowles and I am director of the Oregon of the Art Center East. I'm not director of Art Center East. I am, stepping down as president of the board of Art Center East. And I'm very happy to be here tonight. And sorry, I'm just trying to, there we go. I'm just trying to run the video at the same time as I'm talking. And I'm happy to have with us tonight Gregory Luce, a poet from the East Coast who's up a little late tonight. And the first thing I'd like to do is our land acknowledgement, and then I will introduce Gregory Luce, and then he will read from his work. So welcome to everyone. We recognize that we all live and work on Indigenous homelands. Specifically, Art Center East and its programs reside on the ancestral homelands of the Cayuse, Umatilla, Walla Walla, and Nez Perce peoples. A land acknowledgement is one way of many toward showing respect and understanding that these lands carry the stories of Indigenous people's struggle for survival and identity through the effects of colonization. We respect our Indigenous neighbors' resiliency, reciprocity with the natural world, and infusion of arts into traditional lifeways. This acknowledgement challenges us to consider Indigenous perspectives, learn Indigenous histories, seek input from and partnership with Indigenous groups, and take time to participate in present-day Indigenous events and learning opportunities. We invite Indigenous people and groups to continue to collaborate with Art Center East on community offerings. May we learn from the past to improve the future. So it is my pleasure tonight to welcome Gregory Luce. And just a little bit about his work. He is the author of 5 books of poems. He has 2 chapbooks, Signs of Small Grace from Pudding House Press in 2010, Drinking Weather from Finishing Line Press in 2011. He also has 3 full-length collections, Memory and Desire from Sweatshop Publications in 2013, Tile from Finishing Line Press in 2016, and most recently, Riffs and Improvisations from Kelsey Books in 2021. His poems have appeared in numerous print and online journals, including Kansas Quarterly, Cimarron Review, Innisfree Poetry Review, If, Northern Virginia Review, Juke Jar, Praxilla, and Buffalo Creek Review, as well as in anthologies. He recently retired after 32 years from National Geographic and now lives in Arlington, Virginia. He is a volunteer writing tutor and mentor with 826 DC. Greg, we're very happy to have you here tonight, and we look forward to hearing your work.
Okay, thank you, Nancy, and thanks to those of you who are here. Yeah, I greatly appreciate this opportunity. I believe the first time I discovered Art Center East and the poetry program was when Megan Alpert had her book, actually, I guess it was her first book, and she read here. She's a friend of mine from the DC area and then moved out west. She's somewhere around Seattle now. And I also know Shane Beers, who has sometimes appeared here. I have not met her personally, but we correspond, and we're connected on social media. And I do have Naomi here, who's going to read a little bit, after I'm done. Is my connection to Oregon. We've talked about that, she has family there. And I guess I've been to the state now 5 times and look forward to many more, mostly in the western part of the state, of course. But as I said earlier, I'm looking forward to coming and visiting you all sometime out there. So in any case, it's a real thrill to be here. I love the state of Oregon. I really enjoy Art Center East, the writing project, and it's a real honor to be coming into you. And it's worth, this isn't that late for me, really, but it's definitely something I'm delighted to stay up late for. So anyway, so as Nancy said, my most recent collection is it's somewhere between a chapbook and a full length. It's not quite full length, and Tile was the same. So I could say 5 chapbooks. Memory and Desire is a little bit longer. None of them are super long, but it's a nice body of work to have, and I've certainly been very very happy, to be able to publish as much as I have. So this is my latest book. It's called Riffs and Improvisations. This is my battered proof copy that I've read from. It looks pretty nice, but if you get a fresh one, you'll see how nice it really is. Kelsey does a beautiful production job. So as the name of the book implies, this is poems about music. I think I might have read one or two here and there when I've been here, as an open mic reader. So you may hear something you've heard before. It is all about music, as I said. A lot of it is about jazz, which is my actual favorite musical form. So some of it is about sort of like music in general and the spiritual and emotional aspects of it. And a lot of it is about individual musicians that I particularly admire, or compositions that I particularly admire. So I'll try to sample from that as I go along. So I thought I would begin with the opening poem of the book, which in a way does kind of set the tone, you might say, for the collection. The musicians, the bands that are mentioned in here are all, rock, indie rock bands. But as I said, there'll be plenty about jazz as we go forward. This is called Music to It. If I could just put music to it, this feeling that drives me through the metro station, wanting to dance and glide like a disembodied spirit, seen and not seen between all these other bodies. Or this other feeling of enclosure in a transparent cocoon, coiled tight, my camera eye grasping and drawing in every image. Every song that jumps through my earphones, from Counting Crows to Sparkle Horse to Badly Drawn Boy, perfectly frames its moment, but then dissolves into the next. And I can't sit still, fingers and toes tapping, shoulders swaying. I feel my body hurtling through space at the speed of the train until it shudders to a stop. I take a deep breath as I exit the car, walk quivering toward the exit. One last song pulsing against the inside of my head. This one is dedicated to Naomi, who's here. I like to embarrass her with at least one dedication when I do a reading. This one's called Perhaps a Dance. Perhaps a dance, a simple two-step with just our fingertips touching, and my hand very lightly on your back. And if you gently placed your hand on my shoulder, we could sweep each other along in lazy circles around the floor. And if just by chance you pressed your cheek to mine and rested your head against my neck, and I caught the scent of your hair and pulled your body a little more tightly against me, and I couldn't for a moment tell your breathing from mine, or precisely where my leg ended and yours began, and you whispered something into my ear, and everything but the music and our dancing and our breathing stopped. Okay, so one of my favorite musicians, as I said, I really like jazz, but there's, quite a bit of classical music I like, but one of my absolute favorite composers is the French composer of the late 19th and early 20th century, Eric Satie, who in some ways, you would never call him a jazz musician, but he was very eccentric and very unconventional. Any of you who know his work or know anything about him know that. And I read quite a bit about him. And one of the books I read, where there's a couple of chapters devoted to him, it was asserted in one of his later pieces, he was influenced by American jazz musicians who stayed around in France after the First World War, and he wrote some compositions that were influenced by that. And he was credited by this author as being the first French composer to bring the sound of jazz into French music. And I'm going to read a couple of things about Thelonious Monk later on, who I've never been able to document this precisely, but I'm absolutely convinced he was strongly influenced by Satie because he knew a lot of classical music and he had studied it. So the book I've mentioned, by the way, is called The Banquet Years by Roger Shattuck, and it's got chapters about various artists of that period between, just at the end and between the two world wars. And the material on Satie is just absolutely wonderful. So in any case, this is called Satie in the Dark. Gymnopédie number 1 emanates from the speakers, oscillates through the room and into my ears. I turned out the light so I wouldn't feel alone, and though I know what's coming, so I can see better. The faces crowd out of the dark. One by one, they array themselves before me. Old lovers, my dad, my father and mother and the others. Oh, how they crowd around. My own face, aging year by year. And then the recent places, the hospitals, waiting rooms, doctor's offices, all in a 3.5-minute silent movie. I shiver and blink and rub my eyes, and the phantoms vanish as the next tune starts to play. I have a very long poem about Richard Strauss in here that I don't want to go because it is very long. But if you get the book, it's called Richard Strauss and Purgatory. You might be interested. Another one of my absolute favorites, jazz. Now we're going into the jazz portion of the program. I love jazz. Pretty much all forms except the really, really extreme. Totally non-melodic jazz, but my favorite period is the bebop and the post-bop era from the 40s through maybe the early 60s, and sort of like my pantheon, so to speak. It might be the Mount Rushmore of jazz for me is John Coltrane, Thelonious Monk, Eric Dolphy, the other Eric, and Charles Mingus. So this poem was inspired by Mingus. It's called Improvisation, Better Get It in Your Soul. Better embrace it, like Mingus's bass. Stroke it, caress it, pull it in, draw it like smoke, drink it like old bourbon burning all the way down, then give it back. And this is also, doesn't specifically mention Mingus, but it was definitely Mingus inspired. He was a bass player, as you know. This is called Double Bass. The plucked notes of the bass mimic my heartbeats, and then the bow draws out a long moan, a long low moan, the way your hand did, drawn across my back. And to take a little side trip, one of the great things about being from Texas is having, even though I'm not a musician myself, the tremendously rich musical heritage of that state. Virtually every form of music that's ever appeared in America, if it didn't originate there, it was it was taken in a specific direction there, and it's still very, as many of you know, it's still very vibrant. Austin is considered the live music capital of the world, and there's rich musical scenes in places like Denton, Texas, which is a small town north of Dallas, San Antonio, Houston. It's an amazing place. Anyway, so one of the great traditions in Texas is the blues, and Texas has its own style. There's specific things that make it Texas blues as opposed to Mississippi or Chicago, or there are many forms of blues, and they're all great, but Texas is, of course, close to my heart. So this one is about Blind Willie Johnson, who, as his name implies, was one of the many well-known blind musicians to contribute to the blues. This is called Dark Was the Night. He has a song called Dark Was the Night and Cold Was the Ground. Paints are afoot as Blind Willie Johnson sidles out of Waco. Without eyes, he sees shadows black as the night sky. Paint sliding along the cold graveyard ground like a penknife down the neck of a battered guitar. He used to use a knife as a slide. Probably not a penknife, but like a kitchen knife as a slide. There's a whole interesting, there's all sorts of collections of various slide guitar masters using everything from actual slides for guitars to bottlenecks to pill bottles to knives. It's quite fascinating. So now I mentioned Eric Satie in conjunction with Thelonious Monk. What really started me on that connection, what really sort of woke me up to that many years ago, when I really first started listening to jazz, one of the first artists I really listened to a lot was Monk. And I got his album. This is when I was still in college. So we're talking a long time ago. His album Mysterioso, and the title track has an intro that many years later, as I started to get to know more about his music, but also as I started to really listen to Satie, I realized there's a quality it has, the way the intro goes, that is very similar in some ways to the Gymnopédie #1, which I mentioned earlier. And I realized as I really got deeper into Monk and Satie, that a lot of their technique, a lot of the unexpected, the unusual chords, the very difficult chords that many pianists would have trouble playing, that there were strong affinities. I wrote an essay about it and published it I write a monthly column. That was my first one. And as I was doing the research for that, I got some confirmation that other people heard what I heard. I found a blog entry from somebody who had found, I think, I sort of went back to Satie from Monk, and he had gone just the other direction, but came to the same space. So this is called Mystère. So it's, French for Mysterioso. The ghost of Eric Satie hovers over the keyboard, where Monk's huge hands reach for the infinite, grasping at chords that seem humanly impossible. A breeze from Paris, 1920, wafts over the piano. Monk mops his forehead. Somewhere, Satie is smiling. And the next one is possibly the oldest poem in the book. This is the first poem I actually wrote about Thelonious Monk. It's called Sphere. That was his middle name. Nobody knows exactly how his parents came up with that. Even the name Thelonious is rather unusual, but apparently he had a grandfather or great uncle in North Carolina with either that or a very similar name. So I wrote this because somebody I did not know except by reputation, one of the best poets in DC, I may have mentioned this before, is a man named Reuben Jackson. And you could Google him. He's a wonderful poet. He's a really wonderful person. We've gotten to be very good friends. But in his first book, he had a poem that, in a humorous and very loving way, tried to demolish the idea that there was something weird about Monk, or particularly about his music, because he was a very eccentric character. There's no doubt about that. But that his music wasn't really weird or mysterious. You just had to know how to listen to it. So I grasped on that idea, and this, again, in good humor, was not exactly a rebuttal, but it was a sort of rejoinder. And I sent it to Reuben, who praised it greatly, and that started our friendship. And we've been friends for now like over 30 years. And so, poetry can make things happen, despite what I guess it was odd. It actually can make things happen, especially friendships. So this is called Sphere for Reuben Jackson. Mysterioso. Yes, like a gray cat jumping into and out of a sliver of light on the sidewalk. Mysterioso, yes, the way big raindrops hit a metal roof, pool and slide down in spatters and rivulets. The way hot oil jumps and pops its rhythms in the skillet. Yes, Mysterioso, like a walk in the night through New York, New Orleans, Paris, or your city or mine, when the sounds and smells and flavors flow and dance around you. And the feeling is, yes, Mysterioso. I have a poem dedicated to Bill Evans. Actually, this is not too long. I think I'll read this one because I sort of invented a form for this. It's not highly formal, but you'll notice that the last line of each stanza triggers the first line of the next one. This is called Bill Evans Suite. Again, Bill Evans is just absolutely wonderful piano player. He's pretty distinctive. I mean, I think if you hear Bill Evans, you know you're listening to Bill Evans, even if you don't know the particular composition. So this is called Bill Evans Suite, and it takes its inspiration from 5 specific compositions. So I'm going to list those. I put those at the beginning because I didn't want to break up the flow of the poem with the names in each case. So they are Waltz for Debbie, B minor Waltz for Elaine, The Two Lonely People, Like Someone in Love, You Must Believe in Spring. And actually putting those titles together is almost like a found poem in itself. I mean, I think I wasn't conscious of doing that, but it kind of made sense as it was coming out. 1, the fingers move lightly across the keys. Light-footed notes, 3 stepping up and sideways, like a heart with an extra beat. Inside my chest, another waltz. Another waltz for someone lost. A heart stopped under the wheels that moved horribly, unlike fingers, rolling gently along the keyboard. Two hands finding and not finding each other. Finding and not finding each other. Drinking together from the same lonely spring. Slaking the same thirst that one drop from the tip of your tongue could slake. Your tongue slakes my thirst, drop by drop, until the spring runs dry in summer's heat. Even in summer's heat, spring lingers. We seek refreshment from those sources we can find, even in summer's heat, believing in spring. Okay, so I'm going to switch over. I mentioned John Coltrane, and I could actually very easily write an entire collection just about John Coltrane. I think among all of these musicians that I love so much, he is somehow in a category all by himself. At the end of his life, he had probably even transcended jazz, although he was still using, the instruments and the kind of structure of jazz. He'd taken it into a completely different realm. There was a recent reissue of, not a reissue, it was a newly discovered live performance. It's the one of only two he ever did of A Love Supreme. It was in Seattle, as a matter of fact, and it was one of the things that they didn't play in concert much because it was sort of long and it was hard for audiences to relate to in a live performance, but it's well worth seeking out. It was just issued last year. So that had not happened when I was writing the book, and I'm not sure that I would have much more to say about it because I'm not going to read this one, but I do have a poem in here that references A Love Supreme. But this one is another one. One of his favorite standards that he liked to play was the song Lush Life by Billy Strayhorn, who he wrote it for Duke Ellington. It's one of the most covered songs in jazz, I think, and Coltrane himself did it instrumentally on more than one occasion. But there is one album that he recorded as an accompanist for the very, very great singer Johnny Hartman. And I definitely would advise you to seek this one out if you haven't heard it. It has a version which I have not written about, but it's a beautiful arrangement of My One and Only Love by, I don't even know who wrote that one right offhand. It might have also been Billy Strayhorn, or I'd have to look that one up. But in any case, they also did it like an exquisite cover of Lush Life. And one of the things that's interesting about it is that, Coltrane is known for like pyrotechnics, for incredible technique, for his great solos. But in this particular album, he's incredibly restrained and tactful, framing Johnny Hartman's wonderful voice. And comes in, he has his solos that fit the mood, but he doesn't like dominate it the way he might in a different kind of setting. So all that said, this is my response. Lush Life. It has to be Johnny Hartman with Train framing that voice that flows smooth and rich like a river of barrel-proof bourbon, rippling with McCoy's chords, Jimmy and Elvin's beats popping like ice in a glass, and the wheel of life starts rolling you back through the gay places, the low dives. Finally, the side porch, sitting alone late at night, that pint bottle at your feet, almost exhaling whiskey breath, you running your finger around the rim of the glass, tracing each bead of sweat, sliding down the sides, pressing it to your forehead to cool the sudden flush that starts just at the hairline, hands trembling a little now. So another small splash into the glass, slivers of ice tinkling as your hand shakes, the lush life in this small circle of light. And okay, these are the last two. I'm gonna read two more about Coltrane, and I've got a couple of new pieces that I'd like to share. This one's called Train-esque, as in train, Coltrane-esque. The very thought of you after one long evening of talk cascades through my mind like music, like your hair over your shoulders in the flickering candlelight, as the breeze grew chill and your voice came warm across the small space between us. Your words too, cascading like notes, like trains soloing filigrees. And the final poem of the book, again, this is Coltrane. There's a wonderful documentary about his life and music that came out 4 years ago. I don't remember exactly. Naomi and I actually went to see it in the theater, which is sort of rare for me because I don't go out to movies very much. And then I watched it again. I don't think it's on Netflix anymore, but it's worth seeking out. It's called Chasing Train. So this one's called Return to a Love Supreme. The stairs to heaven are uneven, some broken. You go sideways sometimes, take a step down for every two up, but you climb and stumble, always grasping the pure beam of light that he sends back from somewhere he is, always up ahead. I try to work my pen for Train the way he played his sax for God. So that should give you a pretty good flavor of the book. And I'm going to, Nancy was kind enough to put the information on that. I'm going to put in some information. It'll repeat the Kelsey, but as I said, I have some other books. My email is here. You're welcome to email me directly if you want to find out more about the other books. And also there's a link here. No book of poetry about music would be complete without a playlist. So I actually went on Spotify and made a playlist, and the link to that is in here as well. So let's see if it made it. Yeah, it's kind of a long note. So so if nothing else, visit Kelsey, but you might enjoy the playlist, because every composition or every artist that I mention in the book has a piece in the playlist. And of course there's several by Coltrane, and Monk. So do check that out, and that's absolutely free, of course. So what I'd like to do now is I just kind of, actually, I think you can, I see a note in the chat, you went through it. If you have to kind of scroll up in the entry a little bit, it comes out blank because there's apparently a space at the end, but if you move back up to the very top of that particular note in the chat, you should have it. And if not, I'll put it in piece by piece as needed. So in any case, I've been writing, as you might expect, I've been writing, a fair amount about various things. I have almost enough music poems now to sorry, I want to find something else here real quick. I probably have almost enough to have another book, Riffs and Improvisations Part 2 or something similar, because I've got a lot more musicians to cover. I probably could do like a whole, like an encyclopedia, put out a volume every year of new work about music. But in any case, I'm not going to read those now. What I have is, I have 2 poems that are very recent, that were, they respond to the war, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the ongoing war, which I think has affected all of us pretty strongly. And I am not in general a political poet. I don't write a lot of social justice, anti-war, those kinds of things, although, obviously my heart is there. I feel like my skills tend to go in different directions, but this war has had such a powerful impact on so many people. And I went to a reading. It's the biggest Zoom reading I've ever been to. There were like people in the hundreds, and there were Ukrainian poets in Ukraine under fire, more or less, reading work and reading it in translation and then hearing translations. A couple of days later, a good friend of mine here created a sort of informal writing prompt session where, to get the link to it, they asked you to make a donation to one of several groups that's been helping Ukraine, UNICEF and Doctors Without Borders and things like that. So I got some prompts from that and ended up actually with a couple of poems that I thought were pretty good, or, at least I was happy with them. So this one's called Blue and Yellow, the colors of the Ukrainian flag. I was really struck as I started thinking about it, and I realized like what the landscape of Ukraine is like. And a lot of it seems to be very much like where I grew up. I lived, I said, I'm from Texas. I also lived in Oklahoma for a number of years. Big blue skies and wheat fields, not unlike Ukraine. So I sort of felt that, I have no ethnic, or ancestry connection with Eastern Europe at all, but I felt some sort of emotional kinship just based on that fact. So this one's called Blue and Yellow. I grew up among wheat fields and sunflowers under a deep blue sky that stretched from horizon to horizon. When I walked through the fields, I'd usually be hit by 3 or 4 shots, giant locusts clinging to my shirt, and sometimes I'd take 1 or 2 to the head, which made me stagger before going forward. I haven't walked those fields since I was a boy, though. Excuse me, I haven't walked those fields since I was a boy, though I dream of them often. Bright, hot sun, no tanks crushing the wheat. And if I could share my screen for a minute, I want to show you. The next one is an ekphrastic poem. Nancy, can you enable screen sharing? Would that be okay?
You should be able to share now.
Okay, great. Let me hold on a second. I think for the full, okay, let's see. Is that showing now, this painting here? Oh, sorry, hold on. Let me pull it up again. I don't have a lot of experience with screen sharing, so bear with me.
Yeah, if you click on the green button, then
Yeah.
you can pick the window you want to show.
Right, there it is. Okay. So this is a painting by a Ukrainian artist of the early 20th century named Mikhailo Zhuk. You see the name of Zhuk. He was a real polymath. Aside from being a wonderful artist, he also was a designer. He designed the alphabet for modern Ukrainian, the alphabet that's in use now. And he was also a poet. I have seen some brief excerpts from his work, but this painting is called Lily. And this was offered as a prompt in that session I talked about. And I found it just so powerful and so suggestive and haunting, because there's something a lot more going on here than just a nice picture of a flower. So I wrote, you sort of get this in your head. I'm going to turn off the screen sharing. You can easily find him. Just Google Zhuk and he'll come up, and his work is absolutely wonderful. But so I wrote a short poem based on this painting. It's called Lily, after Mikhailo Zhuk. The lily is the rib cage and the heart of the angel whose chest is open like the gate into a garden, but protected by feathery pastel wings. The head is missing, probably floating above the frame, regarding, perhaps tenderly, her open body. And then I'd like to do just one more. This is my most recent one. This is the first finished draft. I've mentioned this before, and I remember last month's poet had some wonderful poems about nature in general, and there were some about birds. And as I've mentioned on occasion, I have a few obsessions that I write about. You got to hear a couple of them in my book. There's music, of course. There's alcohol, and birds is the other one. So this is a poem about a particular kind of crow that I don't believe you have out there in the West. They're called fish crows. They look exactly like the common crow that everybody is familiar with. And the only way you can tell them apart is by their calls. Fish crows have a sort of honking sound as opposed to that more harsh caw of the common crow. So as crows do, they tend to come around in large numbers. And when I go out in the morning and I walk the dog, one of the first things I'm likely to encounter, either overhead or, you know, bouncing around on the ground, is large numbers of crows. And the fish crows and the common crows, I think they get along okay, but they tend to come in like one day, 2 days in a row, there'll be common crows, and the next couple of days there'll be fish crows, and very rarely will you hear both of them on the same day. So I kind of think of them as taking turns in the in the days. But in any case, I love birds. I'm very fond of all the corvids, so I love going out early in the morning, especially now when there's so many birds singing first thing. But there are always crows, and so I finally found the words to talk about fish crows. Fish crows in ascendancy this morning, honking and squawking. A dozen or so assemble, confer and disperse in all directions. Scraps of black flags sweeping through the sky. They settle again and array themselves along roof lines and ledges, punch taut, ready to soar. Such an assemblage of darkness, but regard the eyes shining out of the blackness, lit with a cold fire. All right, thank you. This has been very enjoyable, and enjoyed reading. I hope you enjoyed hearing the poems, and I would be delighted to answer any questions that people have. So.
Yeah, do folks have questions for Greg? That was lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Greg. I do have a question.
Mhm.
Do you play music yourself?
I do not. I used to sing in choirs, and I can carry a tune. And when nobody's around, I'll sing along out loud with what I happen to be listening to if there's words. I would like to be able to. I have some problems with fine motor coordination that make it really difficult to play an instrument. So I sing along. But I have a lot of musician friends. I have a lot of friends in all the arts, and some of my favorites are my musician friends. And I've actually written some lyrics, and a good friend of mine here in DC has set one or two of them to music. So my mother played piano, and she played church organ, so it's in there. And my son, my older son, the one who lives in Seattle now, is quite an excellent musician, although he's not really pursuing it as a career. He can play multiple instruments, and he can sing as well. So
I have a question too. I'm from the Kansas City area, and there Dan Jaffe was a poet. He'd studied under John Charty, and Kevin Rabus, who also teaches at Emporia. Both of them are really into jazz poetry, and I just wondered if you knew them, if you ever connected with them.
I have not connected. The second one you mentioned, another poet, another poet friend of mine mentioned his work, and I looked a little into it. I haven't had a chance to really fully go into it yet.
He's got several books out.
Yeah.
And Dan does too, but Dan has died. He was
Right.
my teacher, and he was in his 80s, but Kevin's young.
Yeah. And of course, poets, the modern American poets have pretty much loved jazz in one way or another, sometimes like the beat poets, although they really did not understand it as much as I admire, like Allen Ginsberg, for example, and Jack Kerouac. They saw it as this sort of primitive expression of some kind of primal things.
No.
It's like all you have to do is listen to one monk composition and realize that this guy's like one of the most sophisticated. You could put him up against Chopin. Not that one's better than the other, but he could hold his own against Chopin or Beethoven, all these people that he actually listened to.
I love Eric Satie.
So yeah,
and I could see the connection with Monk. I was
Yeah.
impressed that you did.
Yeah. My friend Reuben Jackson, I mentioned, he's a DJ. He has a radio show every other week here on the Pacifica radio station in DC, and he'd lived in Vermont for a while and had a regular program on their NPR station. And so we share stuff back and forth. He's led to some discoveries. And he's like me, he likes almost everything, not everything, but he likes stuff that you wouldn't necessarily expect. Like you know, you think, oh, it's all going to be jazz, blues, soul, or whatever. But, you know, like he loves Joni Mitchell, he loves Jeff Buckley. He likes really sappy stuff that I don't like. But, you know, he likes opera, which I'm not too fond of. So I think people that are serious into music are aware of the definitions of like the different categories. Like I know like that's jazz, that's rock, that's whatever. But at the same time, they're not really boundaries. They're fluid. And there's something that unites all kinds of music. And in that sense, it is sort of primal because somehow music reaches us before almost anything else. I mean, little tiny kids will enjoy music even if they don't know what all the word, if it's a song, you know, just the melodies in themselves and rhythm is so essential. I mean, our bodies are made up of various rhythms, you know, working more or less together when everything's functioning right. You know, we have heartbeats, the way blood flows has a rhythm. And so honestly, you know, like we're made, in some ways we're made of music. And so even if you're not a musician, like, and as I'm not, I feel like we carry it with us. And part of it is to listen. I mean, I sort of hinted at that a little bit in that opening poem about how it gets inside of you and it does things, you know, like it comes in and it triggers something that's already in there. And for a poet, that's very, very fertile because it then leads to, you know, I talk about my difficulties with alcohol, I talk about my mental health issues, and there's often a musical context that can help me articulate, even at the same time as it can also be very healing. I went through a year when I was in serious mental difficulty and I could not listen to music. And that was like one of the most awful things about it. And when I first started to listen again, that was a sign that, oh yeah, I am getting better. That even came before I was able to write again. And so, you know, I can't say music healed me, but it was certainly a big part of it.
That's interesting. That's very interesting.
Yeah, I can understand people that don't like some of the things I like. I don't understand people who are indifferent to music though. That just, it's like not liking dogs, you know, you may not want to have one, but how can you not like them?
Well, my mom was never, she was a registered nurse, but she was never into music. She liked a few songs, but it was always, and I'm not talking rock or anything, but whatever the music was, turn it down.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to hear it.
Yeah, I was lucky to have a mother who did play, and she would rehearse, you know, she'd practice for the Sundays, and sometimes she, you know, she had a lot of sheet music. Sometimes she'd just sit down and play, and I never failed to stop what I was doing, or even if I was somewhere else, I would definitely hear it. And I sort of learned a few, you know, the names of some composers and some pieces just from that, because I go look and try to make sense out of these, you know, these funny marks on the page, and I sort of understood. And we had some records around, you know, they weren't serious like music fanatics like I am, but there was always some music of some kind around. Yeah.
Where did you start with poetry? Did poetry come after your interest in music, or where did that start?
No, actually, I love talking about this because, you know, I've been interviewed a couple of times. And this is of course, this is a standard question for poets, and it's a very good one because it can really give you a lot of insights into someone's work. When I was very small, and I was living, well, first of all, living in Dallas in the same city as my mother's parents. Of course, I spent a lot of time with them. She was very close to her family. And so I got to know both of her parents very well. They lived both into my adulthood, which was really wonderful. And so books have always been pretty important in our family, and both of them were readers. Both of my parents were readers. I had books, you know, I have no idea when I saw my first, or like sort of understood that this is a book, but I learned how to read fairly early. But before that, my grandmother would sit down with me a lot of the time and read stuff. And she sort of helped me. I sort of learned how to pick out, you know, it started to make sense. I started to be able to pick out some of the words. And of course, I learned a little bit more about how they fit together. But one of the things that she would read me, and I'm thinking maybe some of the other adults in my life did too, was A Child's Garden of Verses by Robert Louis Stevenson, which is an absolutely wonderful book. It is just, it's such a, you know, it's timeless, it's beautifully written, it's not patronizing. You know, he was able to go into the sort of consciousness of a small boy and just write what it was like, you know. And I remember I couldn't have articulated this at that time, but the thing that really got me was he has that one called The Land of Counterpain. And he's, you know, he was very sick. Actually, he was very unhealthy his whole life. He died very young, but he was a very sickly child. So he ended up spending a lot of time in bed when most other kids would have been, you know, I don't know what they did in his time, but they would be outside, they'd be doing things. And he had to spend a lot of time inside. So he seemed to have had an amazingly fertile mind. And I imagine what he wrote about as an adult was his putting his thoughts together and his experiences to real, you know, from his real life. But he would play with his toy soldiers in bed. And I used to do that. I had these plastic, those little green plastic soldiers that would come 100 in a bag. And I'd put my legs up and it'd be like the mountain and there'd be caves and they'd be having these battles. And so I thought, you know, when you're a little kid, you think you're the only one who does anything that you do. You know, you haven't really connected with the social world. So I was amazed that somebody who'd lived maybe 100 years before me did the same thing. And I didn't think about it. I mean, it was just sort of, it went in there. And I thought about it many years later, and I realized that's what got me started, because I really love those poems. And I started doing it, you know, like grade school, you know, you have to write one once in a while, and I did it. But for some reason, I like doing it. And I kind of kept it up. And I guess you could say I really kind of started it seriously in high school. You know, I wrote all the bad poems imitating all the like romantic poets and things like that. But you know, you have to do that unless you're a prodigy. You got to get all those out. And I ended up in college. I kind of stuck with it. I became an English major, and I did take some undergraduate creative writing, and I got some encouragement. So I ended up getting a master's degree in creative writing. I still wasn't that good, but it was at least like adult level by that point. And just, you know, so I've really been doing it pretty much my whole life once I started being able to write. You know, when I could write complete sentences, I would write, you know, the usual stuff about the birds and the cat and dog and things like that. But I don't know, for some reason it just took hold, and I've never not been writing poetry no matter what else I was engaged in. I didn't, you know, and I published sporadically until, you know, around the middle of the well, I mean, I was publishing individually a lot. And then my first book came out, I was like almost 50. And then it's been, you know, you get your foot finally that far in the door, and it comes a little more readily. You know, you understand the mechanisms, you know how to look at a publisher and think, okay, this would be good for me, or they might like it. And so I've been really fortunate in a relatively short time to publish as many books as I have. And now that I'm retired, I actually, you know, people say, oh, when I retire, I'm going to write that great novel. Well, I don't think I'm going to write a novel, but one of the things I knew I could do more was not only write, but I love just immersing myself in poetry. Many of my friends are poets. Naomi and I, among other things, bonded over poetry because she's a very good poet herself, as you'll be hearing. And of course, she's been a tremendous help in helping me, you know, craft mine, get them past the first draft stage. You don't need this. Why don't you say more about this or whatever? You know, I think that's invaluable for a writer. You have to have some writer friends who are willing to be as direct as possible. And you know, like, you don't want to hurt somebody's feelings, but you know, to willing to risk saying, well, this doesn't work. But who also, when they praise something, you know, they know what they're talking about. Because I have a lot of friends who aren't poets, and they go, oh yeah, this is great, because, you know, it's a poem. So one of the great advantages I've had is in retirement is being able to actually facilitate the publishing of several, like, I guess, like we're up to about 7 books. I'm a board chair of an organization in DC called Day 8. I think on one of my previous appearances, I mentioned that I edit the poetry for, we have a journal called Virgin. And out of our poetry publishing efforts that way, we've created a project where we publish a new poet once a year through a competition. And so I've helped bring that about. That's why we were at AWP this year, is because we're trying to go up to another level, not so much for books, but just in general. We're launching a poetry journal. We're hoping for a nationwide reach. And so we were up there making connections. And so I have all sorts of things that I love to do, like bird watching and riding my bike. I've got my dog, because I have this relationship with Naomi. I've got 2 grown sons, but poetry just is so it's almost like that's what I am. And all these other things are enhancements of it, or I'm related, I relate to people based on our shared interest in poetry. So it's, I can't really, it's hard to describe how important it is.
Wow.
Can
Well,
I,
that's,
Yeah.
go ahead, Nick.
can I ask if you, I mean, do you write to music, to jazz?
Sometimes.
And
Yeah.
yeah, my question is, what's the difference when you do versus don't, and what are sort of the risks to sort of giving yourself over to music and letting it flow?
Well,
it's just like sticking with the silence and
yeah. Well, one of the great things about jazz in particular, as I said, I've written about other things, but the great things about jazz, about the really, really great jazz artists, whether they're performing or composing, is you listen really carefully for those intervals between notes that, like, you understand, even though you couldn't really, like, you listen to a composition, you're hearing this music, but I listen over and over to a lot of the, I listen over and over to a lot of the compositions that I like. And a lot of times it's with headphones. So you can hear like layers and textures that aren't as apparent even from a nice pair of speakers, or at least in my experience. And you start to hear the way the sound plays off. It's hard to describe because I don't really have the technical vocabulary of music, but there are ways that the music sort of grows out of the silence and the pauses. Sometimes there's just a slight transition from one soloist to another one. And you can sort of begin to see, like, particularly watching Thelonious Monk, there are a lot of really good videos of him performing, and they will often show his hands. And it's absolutely fascinating to watch, because one of the reasons I like him so much is he is clearly thinking as he's playing. Like, his hands are almost like they have their own brain. And as he's reaching for a chord or a note, I mean, he's written this thing, but jazz is so largely improvisatory. He's thinking about every chord moment to moment, and yet somehow it's flowing. So you can almost see his hands thinking about what he's going to play next. And, that just blows me away. That doesn't, like I said, in that one poem, it seems humanly impossible that somebody could do that. And I remember when I was watching, I watched Ken Burns' jazz series probably in full 3 or 4 times, and also seen many of the individual episodes more than that. But the one about Monk, Wynton Marsalis says one of the things that strikes him most about Monk is how logical the compositions are. As even though jazz is supposed to be kind of free form and they're not like traditional melodies, I mean, you have to pick out the themes carefully. By listening to him and watching him play, I have this sort of intuitive understanding of how the composition, like, after a while I say, okay, I know why this chord followed this one, even though I couldn't really explain it. It just feels so right. And so I don't know if I'm probably dancing away from your question a little bit, but, and of course, I guess also like that one Satie in the Dark, that experience of listening to his music where there's a strong chord and then a definite silence before the next one. I find that very powerful. I can't do a lot of actual composition while music is playing because it sort of interferes with the rhythm, but I will often listen to something maybe 2 or 3 times and then take those thoughts and feelings and try to put them on paper. And then maybe when I'm revising, and when I write prose, I like to listen to music because it doesn't work quite the same way. So I hope that gets at what you're trying to find out. And I could answer more if you want. So.
No, that's great. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Do you write yourself, or do you play music, or both?
I dabble. Not enough.
Yeah, it's a great. Be careful, because it's like I say with bird watching. You say you're going to step out one day and, I'll try to figure out what that is, or you go to a friend who's a bird watcher and say, hey, take me with you, and it's like, then it becomes obsessive. You get the
I was a birder
binoculars.
before I was a writer.
Right.
I don't do that enough either.
Yeah, but you know what,
But I'm currently writing a book about a bird, so I'm
excellent.
doing it now.
Great. Well, let us know when it's out. I have a lot of books about birds besides a lot of poetry books. So
Well, let's give Greg a round of applause. Thank you
Okay,
very
thank
much.
you all. Thank you.
Yay.
Thank you all very much. Yeah, it was a real joy.
It was great to have you. Thank you so much.
Mhm.